Hi, you're listening to Boggy Talk, Faith Conversations in the Mud, a resource of Church on Bayshore. Boggy Talk is recorded on Boggy Bayou in Niceville, Florida, and is hosted by Justin Wyatt and James Ross, pastors at Church on Bayshore. We typically want every matter of faith and life to have crystal clear answers, but it isn't always that easy. This podcast digs in to help Christians think with a kingdom mentality about topics that sometimes get muddy and bog us down. So let's dive in.
Hey, and welcome to Boggy Talk. We are so thankful that you have joined us today as we kick off a new series talking about Generation Z, issues facing Generation Z. Before we dive in, want to reach over and say, hey, buddy.
Oh, man, you
actually
reached over today.
Reached over because, you know, we can be closer than 6 feet now, I guess. And how you doing, James?
I'm good. I'm within 6 feet of you.
There we go.
It's Tuesday, May 11th, and
Mother's Day.
Mother's Day's done.
May is May again this year. I feel like May is always like this crazy month, getting to the end of the school year. And
it is
last
one
year
of the busiest months of the year.
Yeah, and there's just so much stuff happening, and there's concerts, and there's this and that, and things to be at, and games and tournaments. And last year, none of that happened.
That's true.
And May is May again. It is busy, and because of that, I think I'm just tired, but that's also every other month of the year.
That's true. That's true.
Stage of life. So we are this series. We are talking about Generation Z, and we're talking about Generation Z because this is really the next up and coming generation. They're starting to become parents, and it's important for us as a church, as a people, as leaders, as the people of God to say, hey, we want to understand this generation and how to reach the next generation. That's actually one of our core values as a church, is that the priority of every generation is the next generation. So as we kick off, we want to just help you understand a little bit about generations, because maybe you're not familiar with some of this and why generations are named what they are. And so a quick overview of generations. So if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, you have what's called the greatest generation. This is generation born in 1901 to 1927. Following that, you have the silent generation from 28 to 45. And they're called the silent generation because they were born during the Great Depression and World War I, after the effects of World War I, the Great Depression, and then World War II. And so there's actually just not as many people in that generation, so called the silent generation. Then we have the boomers who came after World War II.
Okay, boomer.
Boomer. Okay, boomer. Yeah, you hear that joke. If you don't know that, just Google it and then be offended if you're a boomer. 46 to 64. Then we have Generation X, 65 through 80.
MTV, man.
And,
MTV.
Yeah, MTV. I want my MTV, which really didn't have a lot of music to be. Well,
it did for them. It did for them.
Yeah, that's
it did
true.
for Gen X. Yeah.
That's true. I remember growing up, we didn't have cable, but my grandparents did, which is kind of funny. And so that's when we got to see MTV. And then my grandma would come in and say, turn off that devil music. And we would, and then we would turn it back on. So that's just what we did. So you have Generation X.
So you turn it to VH1?
VH1, which was slightly less, a little more.
Man. Pop-up video.
Oh, man, we are so dating ourselves.
Oh, no. Okay.
And then you have,
because those are things that Zennials watch.
Zennials, yes. So you had this micro generation, which we are both a part of, the Zennials, which born 77 to 83, which really we say it's the best of both, Gen X, and then the next generation, which is millennials, 81 to 96.
The purist would say like that there's not Zennials, but the reality is there's such uniqueness to that group that they've.
Yes, and the uniqueness is that generation, the Xennials, 77 to 83, came up in a. They were present for the dawning of the internet.
Yeah.
And so they have most of their childhood was lived without it, but most of their, high school and then college years and beyond were lived with it. So they can walk in both worlds. Then you have millennials, 81 to 96, and now Generation Z, 97 to 2020. 2012. So Gen Z represents about a third of our global population. So right now, airing in 2021, they are between the ages of 9 and 24. So that's a large range, and each one of these generations typically grouped by a group of 15 years. And we recognize that obviously someone born, let's just take Generation X, for example, in 65 versus someone born in 1980, yeah, they're the same generation. They're going to be very different. But that's just a helpful way of understanding generations. And these generations are formed by significant events in the world, technological advances, cultural advances, and then really the response to those. So as we're talking about Generation Z, we're talking about those born between 97 and 2012. And a helpful way of understanding some of the descriptors of Generation Z. I'm going to go through this quickly. Is this? This comes from Tim Elmore in an organization called Growing Leaders, and he does a lot of generational research. They are private. They're a private generation, much more so than millennials, because they've learned from millennials' mistakes of oversharing on social media. So they are much more private with their information. They are anxious. This is the most anxious generation that we've had. They are also restless, don't like to be in one place at one time too long doing one thing. And so
FOMO, man.
Yeah,
that fear of missing out.
And so what this translates to career-wise is that this generation doesn't necessarily think one career for the rest of my life, but I like this now, I'll do this now, and then I can jump over and do this later. They're also incredibly tech savvy, which if you know someone younger than you, you'll be like, yeah, they are, because they've literally grown up with technology in their hands from the time they were very young. They're also very nurtured, which
millennials had like access to technology, but there
were still limits,
right? And we kind of developed it by the time this generation,
yeah, because now there's Wi-Fi everywhere, and it's
right.
kind of there's actually a survey that said that access that majority of people in Gen Z considered access to Wi-Fi more important than access to restrooms when going out, which, my generation older is like, no, we need the bathroom. Right? So that's just how important tech is. They're also very nurtured, entrepreneurial, thinking, I can start this. They're very much as a generation thinking we can fix things, and also because of that they are redemptive, that they see themselves as very empowered to make changes. And so every generation, I think, does this to some extent, looks at the generation before them and say, you messed it up, and we're going to fix it. But this generation even more so feels empowered to make these changes. Okay, yeah. Makes me think of that song, Every Generation Blames the One Before. I don't know that song. In the living years, it's an oldie, but it's a great one. So also, it was actually making me think of the John Mayer song, Waiting on the World to Change, which is about millennials. And Gen Z's like, why are you waiting on the world to change? Do something about it. Exactly. So Gen Z is being parented by Generation X. So we got to think through, who's parenting, because that factors into things as well. So they're incredibly, Gen Z, incredibly globally connected. So they're growing up in a world that seems increasingly small because it's connected with technology. Yet here in the U.S., it's also the most racially and ethnically diverse generation we've had. So for those of you who are older, just think about this. You could ask someone in Gen Z, if you ask someone up here, where were you on 9/11? Everyone knows where they were on 9/11. Gen Z would be like, they may not know. And they weren't born. Yeah. And they may literally say, why was that such a big deal? How did that change things? And if you were there, you recognize it changed things instantly. So that's just perspective. So let's talk about why are we talking about this, and why is it important to understand Gen Z? If I were to say, why should we understand Gen Z? What would you say, man? Yeah, well, I mean, so personally, as a Zennial, millennial, possibly based on how you would define me. No one can define you. I'm a 38-year-old pastor, and I realize, Lord willing, my greatest days of ministry are ahead of me. And it's primarily, most people's primary influence is on those who are about 15 years younger than you. And so that's Gen Z. I mean, that's who that group is. So when we say as a church, we want to reach people, typically the most reachable people are the people who are entering into adulthood, who are making those decisions about who they're going to be and who they're going to marry and beginning to parent. And so
if we're true to that, it is Gen Z. So I think we need to say, who are they and how do we engage them and how do we equip them to be who God's called them to be?
Exactly. And I think too, if there's ever, this is probably coming up, and Gen Z as they're entering adulthood, and some have already entered adulthood, it's really for the church. We have to recognize that this is a very unchurched generation. So generations before, even if you weren't a believer, follower of Christ, you had some familiarity with church, or you'd probably been a couple of times, but a lot of what their understanding of church is shaped by perceptions in the media, not from their own experience. And that's important to recognize, because there's not necessarily a common language that's spoken, or common understanding of churchy language.
Right. So you're starting to get into our topic for today.
Yes.
Of really the first challenge when we talk about our issue, we talk about, and I would say this is probably the most important one, because hopefully, we're pastors, and this is, we're focusing on issues related to Christianity. And so when you talk about issues facing Gen Z, I think the most important thing is, where are they spiritually?
Yes.
And indeed, we live in what many philosophers are calling now a post-Christian America.
Right.
So what you're saying is right. So we're going to try to reach and engage and equip. We need to understand what the mindset is about Christianity when it comes to this generation.
I think of it in terms of this. It's, I think in my generation and in older people, people older than us, there could be this mentality of like, hey, I know I haven't been living right. I need to go get things right with the Lord. That was kind of like an understanding. I think if somebody would say, hey, you need to get right, you need to get your life right, to someone older, they'd be like, yeah, I know I do. And now the common mentality would be like, hey, you should get your life right. They're like, what are you talking about? I'm fine.
Yeah. So I didn't grow up in the church, but it was very clear to me that there was the church people who thought that the way we lived, my family lived, was wrong. Some of them kind of in an inappropriate way of saying that, but others just, it was clear we lived our lives differently, and they felt that. I think even though, so I'll use Niceville because this is still a pretty churchy area comparatively speaking when we look at the rest of the state and globe. But many people who don't do church, the church people aren't even really saying to them, hey, the answer's church. Because even it's really generations above, but they're not presenting that as the answer like it was always presented to me when I was a kid not growing up in church. And that's maybe a way to explain post-Christian. Like, it's not even on the radar that that's the answer. Yeah.
The answer was more likely to be like, well, you should have some downtime. You should have some self-care. You should do this. You should you can take care of your needs. You can just get the right steps and the right things in place, and you'll be okay. I think a couple of factors too is that growing up in a more pluralistic society, faith-wise, there's a tendency to kind of like, hey, there's not necessarily this objection to Jesus, as long as it's like my understanding of Jesus was a good guy, teacher, taught some good things. So I'm going to pull from that. I'm going to pull from this source of faith too. I'm going to pull a little bit from here, and that's fine because I'm developing my own truth, and I'm going to live my own truth, and that's a common theme. And then you add into we have an incredibly hypersexualized culture, and access to technology. And then parenting style is letting kids make a lot more choices for themselves rather than just authoritative. That's just a shift in parenting style. So at this quote, it says, we've raised kids in a self-directed model of parenting in a hypersexualized world, meaning that Generation Z has grown up faster and lost their innocence sooner than any generation prior. And now we're facing a dynamic world they are confused about God, church, morality, and faith. Because there's all this access to information, but not a true, solid source of truth.
I think this is nuanced, and that's why it's on Boggy Talk, because we're in the mud here. There was a common narrative in America for a long time.
You sound so philosophical
Thanks,
right now.
man.
I'm like, I'm going to lean in and listen.
Yeah. So at least in Southern America, there's really two narratives when you trace back to the beginning of America. There's the hey, we're Christian and we're here and we want a Christian nation. And then there's the other group that's like, we're Christian, but does freedom of religion really mean Christian? I mean, those were the two dominant thoughts. And those kind of diverged, like over time to where we got to where we're at today, where there's two views of America. One is very secular, one is very Judeo-Christian. Well, the narrative, when you think about it in the schools and all that, by and large, has completely become not Judeo-Christian. It has become progressive. It has become, what is right in our heart and follow what is right in our heart and what is right collectively as a society. So when a Gen Z is coming into, okay, now I'm going to make my own decisions about life, they're not seeing it through this Judeo-Christian narrative anymore. They're seeing it through progressive secular narrative. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not spiritual, because actually more and more studies on Gen Z, because we're just starting to really understand Gen Z, and we're actually finding out they're way more spiritual than millennials are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is Gen Z across the globe is way more religious.
Right.
So when we talk about Gen Z in America and we talk about Gen Z globally, they're very different, because the connectedness of the world has actually made the world's Gen Z more interested in religion.
Right.
But it's made these Gen Z less interested in religion, but more spiritual.
And as in all things, over time, and I think this is true amongst generations, there's pendulum.
Right.
And so there's like.
Now you're philosophical.
I am. Wow. We're so philosophical. We're going to call this philosophical talk.
Okay. That's good.
But there's a pendulum switch where, we look at this generation before us, we say, well, they got this wrong.
Right.
And so rather than come center, we overcorrect. And so I think, whereas I think one of the reasons that Gen Z has become much more spiritual is they saw millennials in large, many of them kind of, the spirituality became the spirituality of the self, and you don't need anything outside yourself, which was kind of an overreaction to seeing through some of the insincere faith and practice of religion before. And so but now there's like, well, actually we do think there is something outside of ourselves, but we're going to try to figure out what that is. So exactly.
And we have so much information to pull from versus just like what the narrative is in our region, because we're so connected.
And then factor in to, a culture, like you said, a progressive culture, a secular culture that does teach and ingrain in us that there isn't really a truth. Your truth is your truth, and you can't tell someone that this is truth, and which is truth. And so we've talked about that before. So really you just had these pendulums swinging. And so we've got to say is, okay, well, as someone who's older, it can be easy in the church or in life, even in parenting, to say, shake your head, wring your hands, and say, I just don't get this next generation, these kids these days. And we can't do that, because that's just writing things off. And that's like also assuming that we got everything right, which none of us have. No generation has. So we do want to understand what it's like for Gen Z in a post-Christian world. And then how do we move into meet those needs, meet them, address them, provide, reach them. So what do we do about this? What do we do about Gen Z growing up, post-Christian world, entering adulthood? What do we do? Yeah,
and I think it's easy for this to be overlooked. Backtracking a little bit, but so when you started out with that list of generations, you talk about the greatest generation and the silent generation, and then then you have the boomer generation, and typically like each generation was the parent of the generation before. But starting with boomers, they didn't have kids till later. So Gen X was actually more like the kids of the silent generation, some early boomers. Boomers mostly had millennial kids, and then Gen X is having Gen Z kids, so you see a skip in generation because we're waiting till later to have parents. But what's so important is Gen X is like the most unchurched generation, because such an emphasis was placed on the preference of boomers because they were so big and so opinionated
and had money.
No offense, boomers, which Gen X have money too, but they were neglected so so because church changed, right? Church changed to cater to boomers. That's a seeker sensitive movement. Rick Warren,
Right.
all that stuff. Like that's what you see. Then millennials has become the focus. Like, how do we reach millennials? They're so big. And I think it's going to be a challenge for the church to not overlook Gen Z in
Right.
the same way we overlooked Gen X.
Right. And it's funny as you're saying that, it is funny when you look and you see all the animosity between boomers and millennials, like, online.
It's their kids.
And I'm like,
It's your
you
fault.
raised them.
Yeah, I know.
You made me this way. Like, it's like, why? Because you did this. And I think what you're talking about too is we see this in and there is I would say even in our own church with folks in Generation X, there is kind of this there are people in our church of that generation, but there's really a missing piece. And I think, these are people who have kids I think honestly, that's why travel ball, like people just automatically say yes to that and no to church. Even people who've grown up in church, because they're like, well, we kind of like, we don't really need this.
Right.
And that's wrong. We don't want to be like, but that's made the choice easier because they were overlooked. And I think you're right. We can easily do this with Gen Z and not truly engage them for who they are, because there are some similarities to millennials. And it's easy to just jump to lump it all together.
Right.
And so we've got to say, okay, well, this generation is coming up. So what do we do about this? And what would you say our priorities as a church reaching Gen Z? What do we need to do?
Yeah, well, I think that starting, at home, we need to parent with all of this in mind. My children, depending on what you define Gen Z are all Gen Z or are Gen Z and then on the cusp, of whatever the next generation is, Generation Alpha or whatever we're going to call it, is going to be. And so, I think that we need to realize just they're being brought into a post-Christian world, and for the first time, they're really in the minority, and even I would say viewed as, I'm trying to think of the right word that's not too offensive here, but really viewed negatively for holding
there's
Christian
a negative
views
perception of
if they
for
are
them.
Christian. Yeah.
And that may not be the case right now here in Niceville, where it's still, it's somewhat culturally advantageous to be but it will be that way. And it certainly is that way in other areas where it's like, oh, you're a Christian. Well, you are, you're outdated, you're bigot, you're this, you're that, all these is something,
Yeah. And I think people are hearing this and saying, oh, well, that's what I was told. And that's not true of my kids. If your kids have families, they're millennials, like they're not Gen Z. We're talking about the group that's graduating high school, the group that's, moving into starting their life. And they indeed in many places are going to experience this. And I would say even in Niceville, they are experiencing that, this as well somewhat.
Gen Z too, because they've grown up in a digital world and they crave actual relationships, but they also do genuinely connect with people digitally. So we have to navigate that. But I think people crave relationships. So as a church, we have to be really engaging and relational and not superficial in relationships. Because I really do believe Gen Z and millennials too don't have a tolerance for surface level relationships. They crave relationships and they don't want to waste their time. So they don't really want to be in a group of 40 people in a group. And I'm not picking on, our groups per se, but they want to be in a small group or a life group of 40 people where the conversation stays at the surface level and they don't actually get to know people. And they actually want to dive into deep, hard issues. And really this generation, going back to the nurtured generation and being nurtured and also being anxious, this generation is actually far more comfortable talking about their inner thoughts, feelings, really their struggles than generations before. That's a strength, and we've got to play into that. That's terrible. We've got to press into that and create communities that are redemptive, that are centered on the gospel, but also make space for this belonging and relationships that we need.
Yeah, I think that it's actually a positive, and this is offensive, but it's just really true. So they don't want to be a part of relational groups that aren't of benefit to them.
Right.
Well, that's really true of everyone. Previous generations, because they're not so connected online, benefit from coming and sitting in a Sunday school class or a small group of 40 people and not hardly participating because they get a little bit of social interaction. But then that group doesn't necessarily do what Jesus calls it to do, because we win. We get some social interaction. So a younger group, the Gen Z specifically, doesn't need that because they already have the social interaction here. I mean, that's their primary connection. So then if they're coming to a group, there needs to be like some benefit other than just some social interaction. So that's great because they're not. So what that's going to mean is church attendance is going to be less, but people who are engaged are truly trying to engage.
Right.
So it's actually like there's less fluff.
Yeah, exactly. We're cutting to the heart of, there's less churchy, stuff, to use that as an adjective. I think too, part of it is we as a church and as Christians have to really show them like what it means to genuinely follow Jesus as Christ followers. And
I think that the seeker sensitive movement would say, hey, we keep these people around and eventually it catches on. And maybe the Gen Z focus says, hey, we got to be really intentional because these people aren't going to hang around. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I do think like, so as a church, then like, that's why the answer is not a generational preference. Like, and I think like boomer, silent generation, millennials, like so much of the argument was about style. And it's like, post-Christian people don't give a crap, about style. Like they're not coming, like there is no social benefit for them to come anymore.
Right, exactly.
Like there has been historically, even for me growing up as a Zennial, like there was social benefit for me to go to church when we started going to church.
Right.
Like I felt like we're not church people. Gen Z doesn't feel like we're not church people. They're like, those are the church people.
Right.
Like it's different now.
Yeah. And I think, part of what I was saying too is like think about our kids. Like our children see through us. They see our inconsistencies and they'll call us out on it. And I think that's kind of Gen Z in the church. They're like, well, you're saying this, but you're not doing this. So we want to find a place or people that will do this, that are like, you're saying follow Jesus, but you don't look any different than everybody else. So we want to flesh out what it actually looks like to follow Jesus.
Yeah. And I think we have to be careful here not to make assumptions, about people. And I see, so I'm going to talk about our church specifically. I see a huge separation in our church folk, who are from those generations before, and those who are part of a post-Christian Gen Z. Like we just are so, I think it's because we don't engage. Like we're so deceived. If you're not watching, I'm, grabbing my head because
there is tension in his mind.
Yeah. That's an Indian reference there. Yeah. Like we're just so clueless about how the world has gone. And I think because the world has shifted, and we haven't engaged and we've said, here are the people I like. And I'm glad God has me here, but even people in this area are like, well, I'm glad our part of the world is different. And I'm like, I am too. But as Christian, I can't say, so I'm good.
Right.
Like I've got to engage, like if we ever found a place where there's only Christians who thinks like us, we are not thinking like Christ.
Right. Yeah. Because he was constantly around people who did not believe who he was and didn't want to accept who he was either. So let's talk about this. What are some of the challenges that are going to be that the church is going to face in reaching Gen Z? So we're not talking about Gen Z folks who maybe grown up in the faith and who are we're talking about engaging Gen Z unchurched. What are some of the challenges? Yeah.
Well, I think first of all, we can't settle for having millennials on the platform and thinking, okay, we're a multi-generational church. And I mean, even our church, who a lot of our people think are young people are 40. So if you're from a church that just is you've just caught up with, because basically what happened is you either became a boomer church or you stayed a, silent generation, greatest generation church. And you're just now, you're reaching millennials, and really millennials don't do boomer church. They do their own church. So what's interesting is a lot of the previous churches are the ones who have more millennials in them. So you're like, okay, we got all these people that don't have gray hair on our platform. It's like, okay, well, Gen Z is much younger. And so how are you going to get them on their platform? How are you equipping them to be leaders? Because it has to happen right now because they're about to come into that stage of life. So that would be the first thing I would say is you've got to be equipping Gen Z leaders right now. The second thing I would say is that the Bible as the truth cannot be your starting point for conversations. And in fact, even a lot of times, even if we preach the books of the Bible, you've got to say, how do I help people understand why they need to listen to what I'm about to listen to?
Mm-hmm. So if the Bible, and I agree, like because there's not even an acceptance of that book. That's how they view that book, that religious book that you have is authoritative. So where do you start?
Well, I think you start with, so what's cool about our generation is now we've seen, like 100 years ago, it was like, okay, if we follow the secular thought and these secular philosophies, we're going to be better people. And now we have the benefit of history on our side that says, actually, and we talked about this when we were talking about, objections to living sent, like now we see that like secular thought actually moved past science. Secular thought moved past things and there's a new morality. So if we can talk about like the issues with that morality, we could like present, here's all the problems and here's the confusion. Because Gen Z is like, what is the truth?
Yeah.
Like they're not like, millennials were like, the truth is, Gen X and, boomers were like, the truth is Freud, and the millennials are like, the truth is pluralism. And now Gen Z is like, so it's like, let's show all these problems. And they're like, yeah, I agree. Now let's present what Jesus said. And when they hear it, it's like, wow, there's truth in this, and again, I can't make anyone believe something, but I think if we present it as like, here's Christianity's answer to this problem that you see, then you have such an opportunity to engage.
Yeah. And I think we as a church too have to include them along the way in the decisions. I think there's a lot of times like, well, these decisions are made by this group of people, which, there is church governance and that is right. But, I think about just even on our staff team. So we've got two young guys on our staff team now who are at this cusp of their Gen Z millennial.
Right.
And
which is Zillennials.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of another microcosm of a group, but, as a staff, we're asking them, hey, what do you think? And they're empowered to make decisions and they may do a great job. And they're also figuring it out. And I do think that we have if they did something and it didn't go well, I think we have a pretty gracious church body that would be like, we still support you. And I think, but it's important to listen and it's important to empower them. But then also to bring them into conversations, even where they're not making decisions, but their input is given because we've got to listen and we've got to say, hey, but what do you think about this? Because you understand this. And I think that's the thing we forget in generations, that we all see it differently.
Right.
We all have a different perspective. And if we aren't going to ask someone older than us and someone younger than us, what do you think about this? How do you,
right.
Then we're missing out on what could be the best decision, because the church is designed to be, this multi-generation, intergenerational body, but priority of reaching the next generation. So
yeah, and that's the Generation Z has got to start becoming the priority. And I think that again, churches don't keep that going. What's the next generation? How are we going to reach them? And so, yes, like give consideration to all these generations, but me as a generation above is saying, okay, now how do we focus on this generation? And then when we equip them, we won't be 2 generations away from reaching the alpha generation or whatever it is. We'll be 1 generation trying to reach them. And that's the model. That's the model that God has instituted in our biology and that God has instituted in the scripture that we should be following. And I think like we have to realize that like they're going to wrestle with things that we don't wrestle with and be okay with that. Like, transgender issues, which we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about some of those issues.
Inclusivity and all those things, like, because they've grown up in that, it's going to be harder for them to fully like just see what Jesus says about that as truth. They're going to wrestle to that. But in the same way, like I would say, people above us like have a hard time separating nationalism from Christianity. Mm-hmm. And it's not because they don't love Jesus. It's just because they weren't indoctrinated.
Yeah, that's what they grew up in. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so like, it's just different. Like how we flesh that out is different. Just like how someone in India and someone in America or someone in China fleshes out these things. And I think like just choosing to be gracious in that is incredibly important. Not compromising truth, but to be gracious in people's wrestling to that.
Right. I think, as we wrap up, it's recognizing that, God has created Gen Z. I mean, that he didn't probably call it Gen Z. That's probably a man-made term, but he's created them, and he's also equipping them to reach them and the next generation. And so as a church, we play a role in that. That is what we're called to do. So we have to invest in them. And I think there's a hesitancy when we have to get outside of maybe our own natural circle and our own generation, there's a hesitancy there because we feel like, I don't know where to start. And here's what I would say is that, Gen Z they need me to understand them. They don't need me to be like them. In fact, I try to be like them, I will come across as really lame. They don't want that. I think about my own kids, they don't like it when if I try to talk like them, they think it's ridiculous. And it is.
My kids, I said sus the other day. You know how the kids, they say
that's
sus.
That's cap.
And they were like, they laughed at me and they were like,
but you say this is fine. No, I'm doing it. But it's like, I
felt like a dork, man. I felt like an old dork.
Yeah, they don't
think they know what the word dork means either.
Yeah, they're like, what is that?
Yeah.
But they do want to be poured into. They do want that.
Yeah,
and so it's like, we don't need to be like them, but we do need to understand them. We need to talk to them. We don't be afraid of feeling old. If you walk into a room of Gen Z, it's okay to feel like you're old because you are older if you're, but be comfortable with that, but talk to them, invest in them, listen to them. I said this one time back when it was really cool to just, complain about millennials. And at the time we were leading this small group of millennials and, they're younger than us, but I'm seeing, and all of them were just like getting so serious about their faith and they were serving and they're pouring into investing. And I was just like this. And I was like, the people who are complaining about millennials are not engaged with millennials.
Yeah.
Because if they would be engaged, they would recognize there's great things about, all generations, we got our stuff.
Right.
And I think it's the same with Gen Z. It's like, if you're actually going to engage, you're going to find out like, they're not scary. It's not that they're this like, I can't, but they don't necessarily need you to be their buddy. They need you to pour into them, to show them what it looks like to follow Jesus and figure out, to be patient, to let them wrestle with, because they are going to be wrestling with things that were taught to us and accepted as truth to us. They're going to wrestle with to land if it's truth or not. And hopefully they will land. This is truth, but we've got to be patient.
Okay, I'm well said, brother.
All right. Said. Well, on that note, then that perfect conclusion.
My seat keeps going lower and lower as I'm sitting. Man. So I think like
you're just sinking deep, man. That's a worship song that I won't sing right now. But the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about some specific issues that are facing Gen Z, and just really that are things that may have been settled in generations prior that are now really culturally, generationally kind of up in the air. And we're going to talk through how do we navigate those.
I was trying to look for the list, but I can't find it.
We're talking about diversity, inclusion. We're talking about LGBTQ issues, sexuality, technology, absolutely, just what it's like, what it's been like growing up.
We should probably have a Generation Z person come on.
I think we will.
Yeah.
So we should do that. So we hope that you'll tune in and learn and glean, and we'll just be quite honest, we are learning as we go too, because, well, that's what we should do. We're not experts in any of this, so if you got questions, want clarity, hey, if you've got some great resources, hey, we'd love to send those our way. And we do hope you'll join us as we continue this series next week. Until then, we remind you, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Boggy Talk. We are so glad you joined in the conversation. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss a beat.